Hello and welcome to TG Talk, where we talk to the generation about reaching the world for Christ. Hello, I'm Bobby Bosler, and in today's episode, we're going to be continuing our series in Philippians chapter 1. We've covered a whole lot of ground thus far, and I took some time to talk in our last episode about what it means to live Christ. And we talked about the fact that living Christ is being surrendered to Christ's will, and it's living Christ's life by depending on His power. I'm going to warn you, this lesson is going to be maybe a little different, a little bit of a different episode than the previous episodes. The previous episodes was really gunning for an action step, and this episode is probably going to be a little bit more informative. It's going to be a little bit more of a teaching episode where really I just want you to understand what's happening in the text. Now, granted, there's application here, and we're going to talk about it. But let's go ahead and dive right in with Philippians chapter 1. We're going to go back to verse 21, where we left off last time, because last time we really just focused on the first half of the verse. In Philippians 1:21, Paul says, "For to me, to live is Christ." And we like that part, right? As far as I'm concerned, here as I'm in jail, as the gospel's moving forward anyway, as I'm praying for boldness to preach the gospel to Caesar, I might get killed, I might still survive, and honestly, I don't care what happens because as far as I'm concerned, life is about surrendering to Jesus and depending on His power to do whatever He tells me to do. To me, to live is Christ. But what about the last part of that verse? For to me to live is Christ, and to die is gain? What is that talking about? How could dying be a gain? Now, the word gain there is the idea of it's a plus. This is a good thing, okay? So he says, okay, on the one hand, as far as I'm concerned, living is all about Jesus, and dying would be a good thing too. Is Paul suicidal here? What's going on? Well, in order to really understand what's going on, it's very important that we understand the context. In fact, if you look back at verse number 20, he says, "According to my earnest expectation and my hope that in nothing I shall be ashamed." God's not going to leave me hanging, but that with all boldness, as always, so now also Christ shall be magnified in my body, whether it be by life or by death. For to me, to live is Christ. In other words, as we've said multiple times, and if you hear me say things over and over again, it's just because I want to make sure you understand with clarity the context. He says, listen, as I prepare to preach the gospel before Caesar, I might live, I might die. My life is all about Jesus. And if I die in the pursuit of Jesus' will and Jesus' life, that's okay too. In other words, Paul says, hey, listen, I'm in a win-win situation here. Now, as we look at the following context, he's going to explain what he means by that win-win situation. Verse 22, he says, "But if I live in the flesh, this is the fruit of my labor." Okay, what? What does he mean there? Now, even scholars who study this, they'll admit that the language that he's using here, the grammar, is a little bit broken up. And I think the reason for that is because what he's talking about is very deep and meaningful to him. He's not just kind of, writing stuff. He's not just kind of typing out an email, non-emotional like. But he's really facing potentially death. And he's grappling between two possible outcomes. All right, he says, if I live in the flesh. In other words, if I preach the gospel to Caesar and I survive, okay, if I'm still alive when this whole thing is said and done, he says, this is the fruit of my labor. Now, that's a little bit of a veiled statement, but the idea of that is I get to continue to bear fruit on this earth. In other words, I get to continue to preach the gospel. I get to continue to minister to you. I get to continue to do what I've done for however many years here in my ministry. He says at the end of verse 22, yet What I shall choose, I wot not. That word wot is not talking about light bulbs. Okay, that word wot is talking about knowing. All right, it's an Old English word. We don't use that kind of a word that way anymore. But he says, listen, as far as I'm concerned, living is all about doing Jesus' will. And if I die, that's okay too. But if I continue and if I survive, I get to still work and bear fruit here on this earth. And honestly, as I'm looking at those two alternatives, I don't know which one I would choose. Now, the funny thing to me about this is that he doesn't really have a choice. I mean, it's not like he can say, excuse me, Caesar, I'm going to choose life. He doesn't get that opportunity. So it's kind of funny to me. And yet he still presents his dilemma in such a way as if he has a choice. If we look at verse 23, he talks about this dilemma even more. For I am in a strait betwixt two. He says, I'm stuck in between these two options, having a desire to depart and to be with Christ, which is far better. So he says here, listen, option number one, behind door number one, here is our first potential prize. If he cuts my head off, I get to be with Jesus. That would be pretty cool. I mean, come on. What could be better? Losing this sinful body and getting to stand before Jesus and fellowship Jesus for the rest of eternity. That's pretty good, wouldn't you say? He says, listen, I'm grappling between these two potential outcomes. Honestly, there's a sense in which I could go and be with Jesus, which is far better. And honestly, young people, can I just say this? When you get to stand before Jesus, I know this sounds cliche because we sing about it. It'll be worth it all when we see Jesus. Life's toils will seem so small when we see Christ. And you know, young people, the greatest thing that will ever happen to us is that one day when our heart stops ticking or we get raptured up to Jesus, we'll get to be with him and see him like he is, and we will be like he is. It's going to be amazing. It's going to be great. He says in verse 24, though, I'm grappling between these two potential outcomes. If I go to be with Christ, I mean, what could be better than that? Nevertheless, to abide or remain in the flesh, to stay alive, is more needful for you. So in other words, he says, here are my two alternatives. On the one hand, I get to die and go and be with Jesus. If Caesar cuts my head off because he doesn't like the way I looked at him, hey, that's a win. I get to go and be with Jesus. However, nevertheless, to remain alive is more needful for you. Now, when he says you, he's talking about the Philippians, right? He's saying, listen, you still need me alive. There are areas in your life where you still need to grow. You still need my input. You still need me to minister to you. And when I take a look at these two options, on the one hand, if I get to go and be with Jesus, that'd be really awesome. That'd be cool. But yet, as I look at things, I realize how much you still need me here on this earth too. If you were to take a look at those two things, I mean, obviously, to go and be with Christ would be amazing. There's a sense in which we might prefer that, and yet, people need us. Young people, your siblings need you. Your neighbors need you. You, in your living a life of Christ's will and Christ's power, is something that is needed in your school. It's needed in your family. It's needed in your neighborhood. It is needed on this planet. And Paul, in his unique situation, he says in verse 25, and having this confidence, having this persuasion, I know that I shall abide and continue with you all for your furtherance and joy of faith. So he says here, in other words, I'm grappling with these two alternatives. If I preach the gospel to Caesar and he doesn't like it and he kills me, I get to be with Jesus. That'd be cool. But as I'm looking at this, I'm realizing you still need me too. And as I consider these two options, I think I know what God is doing. I think, he says, I believe that God is going to bring me through this. I think I'm going to get out of this prison. I think I'm going to be able to continue to minister to you because you know what? You need to be furthered in your walk with Christ. You need to continue to rejoice in your faith in God and in your exercise of dependence. You still need me to teach you and to help you and to train you. It says in verse 26 that your rejoicing may be more abundant in Jesus Christ for me by my coming to you again. In other words, I think you need to see an answer to prayer of me surviving. Now, what does that have to do with all of us? You know, when we look at this, obviously we have been up until this point identifying with the Apostle Paul, right? In his confinement and the fact that he was bold to preach the gospel anyway, that his boldness rubbed off on others and other people were bold as well. And we've been kind of placing ourselves in Paul's sandals and thinking about what he says in light of us being Paul. And we're continuing to do that, but I want you to know here, the idea of this is Paul is saying, I am needed. My life is important in your life. And I just want you to know, young people, your life is important. You may think, man, I'm not worth much of anything. Man, I'm not that much of a spiritual power player, but I want you to know you're wrong. Because if anybody will learn how to live Christ, if anyone will learn how to live a life of total surrender and total dependence, they can become a necessary force in the lives of others. Those of you that work on the bus, I know Cody. Hey, Cody, how's things going for you? Cody probably ministered in the bus this past weekend digitally. Guess what, Cody? Your kids need you. Your kids on that bus route, they need you to live Christ. They need you. Some of you, there are other people, maybe you have a Sunday school class that you teach. Maybe you've got little brothers and sisters, and guess what? They need you to live Christ. God didn't take you off to heaven the day you got saved because you are needed on this planet. Now, I understand God can do anything with anyone in the sense that God doesn't need us, and yet God has seen fit to work through people. And in that sense, the way God has chosen to work in this age is to work through people. And in that way, God needs you. And people need you. And you know, I just want to encourage you here today, your life is important in the grand plan of God. Don't you ever think that you're not important, because you are important enough for Jesus to come and die for you, and you're important enough for Jesus to come and live in you. And it's absolutely necessary for Jesus to live through you. And you know what? We need to do more than agree with it. We need to do more than hitting like on a video or commenting about something that stood out to you or subscribing to an email list or listening to a podcast. We've got to live this out. Because the world needs faith-filled, Christ-filled preachers of the gospel to turn this world upside down for Jesus Christ. I told you there'd be application. A little bit more of a study, and yet I trust it was a blessing to your heart. If you enjoyed this video, go ahead and hit like below. And if you have any thoughts or questions, feel free to leave a comment down below and share this video with others. If you haven't done so yet, hit subscribe and hit that bell to be notified whenever we release a new video. It's been a pleasure, and I think we're going to keep on studying in our next episode in Philippians chapter 1. I've got a lot more to say. I'm never without something to say. And so until then, we'll see you later.